Jimmy Page thought he understood the blues. Then he heard Jimi Hendrix play his own guitar, and everything he believed about music collapsed in a single afternoon. October 15th, 1968. Olympic Studios, Barnes, London. The most famous recording facility in Britain, where the Beatles had recorded, where the Stones had created their masterpieces. Studio 2 was booked solid for the day. Led Zeppelin was laying down tracks for their debut album, the record that would change rock music forever. The studio smelled of cigarettes and coffee, with thick acoustic tiles covering the walls. Outside, London was gray and cold, but inside Studio 2, the atmosphere crackled with creative energy. Everyone in the room knew they were part of something that would define the next decade of rock music. Jimmy Page arrived at 2 p.m. carrying his sunburst Gibson Les Paul in its familiar black case. At 24, he was already considered one of Britain's premier guitarists. He'd been a session musician for years, playing on countless hits, working with everyone from The Who to Donovan. The Yardbirds had made him famous, but Led Zeppelin was going to make him a legend. Page had strong opinions about blues music. In his mind, British musicians had taken American blues and refined it, made it more sophisticated. While American blues relied on raw emotion, British players like himself approached the guitar with precision, building solos note by note, engineering feelings into complex musical architecture. The band was in the middle of working out arrangements for what would become Since I've Been Loving You, though they hadn't settled on that title yet. Page had been developing this slow, heavy blues for months, crafting every note, every bend, every sustain. It was his statement about what English blues could be: deeper, darker, more sophisticated than anything coming out of Chicago or Detroit. Page plugged his Les Paul into his Marshall stack and started playing the main riff. The sound filled Studio 2 with that thick, creamy distortion that would become his signature. Robert Plant nodded along, already hearing vocal melodies. John Paul Jones worked out a bass line that walked beneath Page's guitar like a stalking predator. John Bonham sat behind his kit, waiting for his moment to add thunder. This was going to be their blues masterpiece, Page was certain. American blues musicians had shown the world what the form could do, but the British had refined it, intellectualized it, made it art. Page believed that wholeheartedly. The blues had been born in America, but it had grown up in Britain. Around 4 p.m., during a break between takes, the studio door opened. Glyn Johns, the engineer, walked in followed by a tall black man with an enormous afro, wearing a paisley shirt and carrying a white Fender Stratocaster. Page recognized him immediately. Jimi Hendrix, the American guitarist everyone in London had been talking about for the past year. "Jimmy," John said, "this is Jimi Hendrix. Jimmy Page." Page set his guitar aside and walked over to shake hands. He'd heard Hendrix's records, seen him perform once at the Marquee Club. Impressive showmanship, certainly. Loud, flashy, theatrical. But Page had always wondered how much of it was genuine musicianship versus spectacle. "Heard you guys working from the hallway," Hendrix said quietly. "Sounds heavy." "We're cutting some blues tracks," Page replied with a slight smile, "trying to show the Americans how it's really done." The comment hung in the air for a moment. Plant, Jones, and Bonham exchanged glances. They knew Page's opinions about American versus British blues. He'd expressed them many times in interviews, always diplomatically, but his meaning was clear. The Americans had invented the blues, but the British had perfected it. Hendrix didn't react visibly to the comment. He just nodded and asked, "Mind if I listen for a bit?" "Of course," Page said. "Always good to have another musician's perspective." Hendrix found a chair in the corner of the studio and sat down, his Stratocaster resting against his knee. Page returned to his Les Paul, and the band resumed working on their track. Page played with extra intensity, knowing he had an audience. This was his chance to demonstrate what sophisticated blues playing sounded like. The riff was complex, moody, built on minor pentatonic scales but with jazz influences, chromatic notes that added darkness and sophistication. Page bent strings with surgical precision, held sustains for exactly the right duration, crafted solos that told complete musical stories. This wasn't three-chord shuffle blues. This was blues as high art. After they finished a take, Page looked over at Hendrix expectantly. "What do you think?" Hendrix was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Nice," he said finally. "Very clean, very precise." Page sensed something in the tone but couldn't quite place it. Nice, very clean. Those weren't exactly the words he'd been hoping to hear. He'd been expecting something more enthusiastic, more impressed. "That's the difference between British and American approaches," Page said, warming to one of his favorite subjects. "We've taken the blues and refined it, made it more musical. American blues can be a bit primitive sometimes. All feeling, not enough craft." The studio got quiet. Plant stopped humming. Jones looked up from his bass. Even Bonham, who rarely paid attention to musical conversations, was listening. Hendrix still didn't react visibly. He just nodded slowly and said, "I see." Page continued, feeling like he was making an important point. "Don't get me wrong, the Americans created the form, but sometimes I think they get so caught up in the emotion that they forget about the technique, the sophistication. Real blues needs both feeling and skill." "Absolutely," Hendrix said quietly. "Mind if I ask you something?" "Sure." Hendrix gestured toward the Les Paul. "Could I try your guitar for a minute?" Page hesitated. He was particular about his instruments. The Les Paul was his main guitar, perfectly set up, irreplaceable. But refusing would seem petty, especially after his little speech about musical craft. "Of course," some Page said, unplugging the guitar and handing it over. Hendrix stood up, slung the Les Paul over his shoulder, and plugged it into Page's Marshall stack. He spent a moment adjusting the controls on the amp, getting familiar with the setup. Then he looked at Page and asked, "What key was that song in?" "A minor," Page replied. Hendrix nodded and started tuning the guitar by ear. Page watched his hands, noting the speed and accuracy. That was professional level tuning, no doubt about it. "Ready?" Hendrix asked. Page nodded, curious to hear what the American would do with his guitar and his song. Hendrix hit the first chord. The sound that came out of Page's own amplifier was unlike anything Page had ever heard from his own setup. It was the same gear, the same studio, the same everything, but somehow completely transformed. The tone was warmer, fuller, more alive. How was he getting that sound? Then Hendrix started playing. He didn't play Page's riff. He didn't copy the arrangement they'd been working on all day. Instead, he played something else entirely, but something that was unmistakably related to what he'd heard. It was as if he'd listened to their version and heard a different song hidden inside it, waiting to be discovered. The melody was similar to Page's, but where Page had been precise and calculated, Hendrix was flowing and intuitive. Where Page had used technique to create sophistication, Hendrix used feeling to create complexity. Every note seemed to breathe, to have its own life and purpose. But it wasn't just the melody, it was everything. The way Hendrix held his body, relaxed but focused. The way his fingers moved across the fretboard, not with Page's studied precision, but with an almost unconscious fluidity, like he was having a conversation with the instrument rather than controlling it. He played phrases that shouldn't have worked together but somehow created perfect musical sense. He found spaces in the harmony that Page hadn't known existed, notes that lived in the cracks between conventional scales. When he bent a string, it wasn't just technique. It was a question being asked and answered simultaneously. The room felt smaller somehow, as if Hendrix's playing was expanding to fill every available space. Plant found himself holding his breath. Jones stopped pretending to adjust his bass and simply stared. Even Bonham, who rarely showed interest in guitar solos, was transfixed. Page stood 6 feet away from his own amplifier, listening to sounds he'd never heard come from his own gear. The tone was unmistakably his Les Paul, but somehow fuller, warmer, more alive. Hendrix wasn't just playing the guitar. He was awakening it. Page stood transfixed. This was his guitar, his amplifier, his studio. But somehow Hendrix was making sounds that Page didn't know were possible. The American wasn't just playing blues. He was reinventing it in real time. Plant, who had been preparing to sing, stopped and just listened. Jones put down his bass. Bonham stopped adjusting his kit. Even Glyn John stopped working the board and turned to watch. Hendrix played for maybe 3 minutes, never repeating himself, constantly finding new phrases, new ways to express the musical ideas. When he finished, he let the last note sustain until it faded into silence. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The silence stretched for 10, 15, 20 seconds. Finally, Hendrix unplugged the Les Paul and handed it back to Page. "Nice guitar," he said simply. Page took the instrument with hands that were slightly shaking. He looked down at it as if seeing it for the first time. It was the same guitar he'd played thousands of times, but somehow it felt different now, like it contained possibilities he'd never imagined. "How?" Page started to ask, then stopped. He didn't even know what question to ask. Hendrix was already walking toward the door. "Thanks for letting me listen," he said. "Good luck with the album." He was gone before anyone could respond. Page stood in the middle of Studio 2, still holding his Les Paul, still processing what he'd just heard. Plant tried to make a joke about getting back to work, but it fell flat. The energy in the room had completely changed. "Should we try another take?" Johns asked from the control room. Page looked at his guitar, then at his bandmates, then at the microphones waiting to capture their next attempt at blues perfection. "Not today," he said quietly. He unplugged his Les Paul, put it back in its case, and walked out of the studio. Led Zeppelin didn't record again for 3 days. Later, Plant would describe those 3 days as the strangest period in the band's early history. Page barely spoke, staying in his hotel room, occasionally picking up his guitar, but never playing anything complete. When the other band members asked if he was all right, he just said he was thinking. "About what?" Plant asked during one of their few conversations. "About what I don't know," Page replied. The other members didn't know how to handle their leader's crisis. Page had always been the driving force behind the band's musical direction, the one with clear vision. Now he seemed lost, questioning everything they'd worked to build. Plant suggested they explore London's music scene, maybe catch shows at the Marquee. Page declined. Jones offered to work on other songs, different arrangements. Page wasn't interested. Even Bonham attempted to engage Page in discussions about the album's direction. Nothing worked. During those 3 days, Page replayed that afternoon over and over. He kept returning to the moment when Hendrix first struck a chord on his Les Paul. The sound had been immediate and authoritative, in a way that Page's own playing never achieved. Page had always thought of his guitar as a tool to be mastered, but Hendrix had made it seem like a living thing, responsive to emotion rather than technique. On the second night, Plant found Page in the hotel bar at 2 a.m., staring at an untouched whiskey. "Jimmy," Plant said, sliding into the opposite chair, "we're worried about you." Page looked up, his expression distant. "Do you think we're making real music, Robert?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, are we expressing something genuine, or are we just demonstrating our abilities?" Plant had never heard Page talk like this. The guitarist had always been confident, certain of his artistic vision. "I think we're making good music," he said carefully. "Good," Page repeated. "Technical, professional, but are we truthful?" The question hung in the air. Plant didn't know how to answer it. On the third night, Page finally played his guitar for hours, exploring the spaces between notes, the emotional content that lived in silence as much as in sound. For the first time in years, he tried to stop controlling his playing and start listening to it instead. When they finally returned to Olympic Studios, something had changed in Page's playing. The precise, calculated approach was still there, but now there was something else. A looseness, a willingness to take risks, a recognition that technique without soul was just exercise. "Since I've Been Loving You" became one of Led Zeppelin's most powerful tracks, but it wasn't the version Page had originally envisioned. It was darker, more emotional, less concerned with demonstrating sophistication, and more focused on expressing genuine feeling. In interviews over the years, Page would occasionally reference that afternoon at Olympic Studios, though he never gave the full story. "Sometimes you think you understand something," he said in a 1975 Rolling Stone interview, "and then someone shows you how much you still have to learn. That's what real musicians do for each other. They reveal possibilities you didn't know existed." The interviewer pressed for details. "Are you talking about anyone specific?" Page was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently playing with his wedding ring. "I remember thinking I knew what blues guitar could be. Then I heard someone play my own guitar better than I'd ever played it myself. Not technically better, necessarily, but more truthfully. That's when I realized the difference between playing guitar and speaking through guitar. Who was it? Jimi Hendrix, Page said simply. I thought I was teaching him about sophisticated blues that day. Turned out he was teaching me about honesty. Years later, Page would expand. The thing about Jimmy was that he never seemed to be trying to impress anyone. When most guitarists play, you can hear them thinking, calculating their next move. With Jimmy, it was like the guitar was thinking for itself, and he was just translating. That afternoon changed everything for me. I realized I'd been so focused on proving I could play that I'd forgotten why I wanted to play in the first place. The interviewer asked if Page ever regretted his comment about American blues being primitive. Page winced slightly. God, yes, it was arrogant and ignorant. I was young and thought I understood the difference between sophistication and authenticity. Jimmy showed me they weren't opposites, they were different paths to the same place. When Hendrix died in September 1970, Page was devastated in a way that surprised even him. They hadn't been close friends, had only met a handful of times, but that afternoon at Olympic Studios had changed Page's entire approach to music. At a Led Zeppelin concert in New York shortly after Hendrix's death, Page dedicated "Since I've Been Loving You" to Hendrix's memory. Before playing it, he told the audience, "This song exists because someone once showed me that the blues isn't about proving how well you can play. It's about proving how deeply you can feel." The story of that October afternoon became legendary among British musicians, though the details were often exaggerated or misremembered. What remained consistent was the impact it had on Page, and through him, on Led Zeppelin's music. Years later, when young guitarists would ask Page for advice, he would often tell them about that day. "Find someone who can show you something you don't know," he'd say. "And when they do, don't worry about your ego. Worry about learning." The lesson from Olympic Studios wasn't about American versus British blues. It wasn't about technique versus feeling. It was about the difference between playing music and letting music play through you. Jimmy Page thought he'd mastered the blues that day. Instead, he discovered he'd barely begun to understand them. And in that discovery, Led Zeppelin found their soul.